Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf on Gimel, Zevachim 33, and we're going to start on Amud on around 11 lines from the bottom. The Gemara in yesterday's daf had said that Ula made a statement in the name of Rish Lakish that we're going to say the concept is that Bia b'miktas is Shema Bia, that if a person puts his hands a little bit into the temple, that's going to be considered like you fully entered into the temple. In that context, Ula says in the name of Rish Lakish that if the person was tamei and he put his hands into the mikdash, into the courtyard of the temple, he'll get lashes. And that's based upon the pasuk of the whole kodesh lo siga. You don't want to touch anything sacred, and we compare entering to touching. Just like touching is even a portion of it, also entering is even a portion of it. And so therefore, Ula is of the position that Bia b'miktas is Shema Bia, citing Reish Lakish. So in that context, Rav Oshaya challenged Ula from the case of a Metzora. Now we know that a Metzora, when it comes to his 8th day of purification, he's supposed to stick his hands and his hand and his ear and his right toe into the courtyard to get the application of the blood on it. And so that's part of his purification process. Now in this context, the Brisa says that if the Metzora's 8th day came on the eve of Pesach, and he was a Balkari that day, so he became a Tvul Yom, he immersed in the mikvah, but he waited for nightfall. So even though a Tvul Yom, generally speaking, from Kari does not go onto the Temple Mount, we're going to say in that case, he can go onto the Temple Mount and receive his purification, because we're going to say better that he should come, better that there's an astay that if you don't do it, you get kares. So the Paschal Lamb will come and override the astay that there's no kares, which is going onto the Temple Mount when you are a Tvul Yom. And Rabbi Yochanan says it's not even biblical penalty; it's only he's in violation of a rabbinic penalty. But anyway, we see from here, says Rav Oshaya to Ula, that if you are of the position that Bia b'miktas is really going to be considered like you are coming into the temple, even though you're just coming in with your hands, then how is he able to stick his hands in? Because in both cases, it's an asay sheyesh bo kares, because now he's not only in the Machane Levi, he's now in the courtyard of the temple itself. And so there's an astay that has kares associated with it, because he's actually in the courtyard of the temple when he's a Tvul Yom. He's not just on the Temple Mount. So Ula's response to Rav Oshaya's question was, from your question, I see the answer, because since the Metzora is allowed to do it, since it's permitted for the Metzora, it's also going to be permitted for the Tvul Yom from Keri. So once it's permitted for one thing, it's permitted for another thing. So this idea that once it's permitted for one thing, it's whole of Ishtri Laha. Once it's permitted for one thing, once it's permitted for the Metzora to go into the courtyard a little bit, it's also permitted for the Tvul Yom. This leads us to another general rule. So says Rav Yosef that once Ula says this, he's also going to say something else. As a general rule, we are of the position that if the majority of the community is tamei from a dead body, then they're able to bring the korban pesach in a state of ritual impurity, because the majority tuma hutra b'tzibur. So that's usually speaking only if they're tamei from a dead body, but not if their majority of the community is tamei from a zav, from a flow coming from their body. If they have tuma ziva, we're not going to say the majority of the community is hutra, is allowed to bring a Paschal Lamb. But says Rav Yosef, Kasavar Ula will be in the position if Ruvan Zavim, if the majority of people were Zavim, Vinasu Tame Mesim, and then they became, after the majority were Tame from a Zav, became Tame from a dead body, then we would say, Hol of a Hutru Tumasan, Hutru was Ivasan. Then we could say, since they became permitted for their Tuma, since they became permitted for the dead body, then also we're going to say there, go back and allow their ziva their ziva tuma to become permitted. Once we have something permitted for one thing, we're going to allow it to be permitted for something else. So Abaye said to his Rebbe Yosef had gotten sick and he forgot a lot of his learning. So throughout Shas, Abaye is gently reminding him, says Abaye, Amroy Abaye, me dummy, they're not the same case. Tuma ishtarye, ziva lo ishtarye. They're not the same case. Why are they not the same case? Because the tuma was permitted, but the ziva was not permitted, meaning to say that the ziva, the thing that was not permitted came first here. The ziva was the one that was not permitted. So you're going to say because he did the ziva and it's not permitted, so now it becomes tummy from a dead body, and then they'll all be permitted. That's not the same case as the mitzorah. The mitzorah started out being the mitzorah was the one that was permitted first, and then it also allowed the later thing, which is the tumah from the tvul yom. So therefore, Abaye says to Rav Yosef, maybe this is what you meant to say. Ruban tummy mason. If the majority of the community was tummy from a dead body, and then they became tummy from a zav, they all became zav, and then we say tumas, and since they were already allowed, so their tumah of the dead body was already allowed. Therefore, hutru was zivasim. So their tumah ziva was also going to be allowed. So Rav Yosef says, yeah, that's what I meant to say. But it says Abaye v'akati lo dami. But still, the two cases are not the same. Why? Mitzorah atero, the mitzorah, when the mitzorah becomes allowed, it becomes completely allowed. It's totally allowed. That's the way the Torah made the decree. That's how the mitzorah goes through the process of becoming permitted. All the ishtari. So since he's permitted, it's permitted because that's exactly the way it was set up from the Torah. But tuma dechuyai, but the tuma is not something that's completely allowed. It was just overridden in this case. So we could say so the tumas could be permitted for one thing, but not for another thing. Meaning, say it was permitted for tumas mace, but it would not be permitted for the tumas ziva because it's not totally permitted. It's just overridden. So it's not the same case as the mitzorah, which is completely permitted. Once it's completely permitted for the mitzorah, it's completely permitted for the tvul yom. It's different from the case of dechuya. Amoy Rava said to Abaye, Adarabba, just the opposite. Ibcha mistabra. It's more logical to assume the exact opposite. Mitzorah, since it's heterahu, since the mitzorah is totally permitted, we could say laha ishtari, laha lo ishtari. So therefore, the mitzorah is totally permitted. So we're going to permit that. But the tvul yom is not totally permitted, so therefore it wasn't permitted for the tvul yom. Whereas tuma dechuya, tuma is not totally permitted; it's overridden. So malicha dechuya, malish dechuya. Once we're overriding something, what does it matter if we're just overriding one thing or if we're overriding two things? So therefore, Abaye and Rav have the same set of facts. They just draw completely different conclusions from it. And we see from here, says the Gemara at the top of Gimel Amud Aleph, Miklau. The Travayu sphere Tuma D'chuya. Both of them are in the position that the Tuma is overridden by the community. Rashi says, it teaches us through the Kohen Gadol wearing the tzitz, and it's not completely permitted. And it's permitted for the Tumas Mace and not for the Tumas Ziva. And why do we want to say that both Abaye and Rav agree? Because now they're considered the Rabbin, the majority in this case, and they say that the Tuma is D'chuya, and they would override an individual. So the Gemara says, let's go back to the position of Ula. What did Ula say? Remember, Ula was of the position that if there are that bia b'miktzah shmei bia, that if you put it partially in, you get lashes, and bia b'miktzah shmei bia, and you get lashes for it. If you go partially in, you get lashes. So let's bring a support for Ula's position. Lema Messiah. Let's bring a support for Ula's position that if you go partially in to the temple, it's a prohibition and you get lashes. What's the support? It says, Kol asmicho shayusham, koralan ani tekef l'smicha shlita. The Brisa says that all the smichos, all that before you slaughter an animal, you have to do what's called smicha on the animal. You put your hands on the animal and you confess your sins and you confess your guilt, or you say the prayer to come closer to Hashem. So all of the smichos that are in the temple, I say about them, they have to be immediately following the smicha is the shlita. Chutz mizu, and one of the theories about this is because if maybe something would happen to the animal, and you wouldn't be able to bring it if you didn't do it immediate, and then it could be a big problem because then you would be misappropriating temple property by leaning on the animal. So it has to be immediate. Chutz mizu, with the exception of the Asha Mitzora. Why? Shahaisa b'shar Nikanor, because the Mitzora himself will be in the gates of Nikanor. She'em Mitzor Yachol Ikanes L'Sham Ad Shemazin Alav Midam Chataso, because the smicha of the Asham of Mitzora was done in the gates of Nikanor. We're on 33a, 4 lines on the top, which is outside of the courtyard of the temple. So the slaughter happened in the. We'll see where exactly the slaughter happened. That had to happen in the northern part of the courtyard of the temple. We have to see what that means. Immediately you should be reminded of this dispute that took place back in our Gemara and Daf Chaf about the three opinions about what the northern part of the courtyard was. So the smicha of this animal took place in the gates of Nikanor because the Mitzor was not able to go in to the courtyard until he had the blood sprinkled upon him from his chatas and from his asham. So therefore, that smicha could not happen directly before the shechita. But if you would not accept Reish Lakish's position that bia b'mitzvahs ishma bia, if you want to say bia b'mitzvahs lo shma bia, that you can go partially in, then we have a perfect solution. You could do smicha tekef l'shchita, you could just stick your hands through the gate of the Nikanor into the courtyard of the temple, v'lismoch, and lay your hands on the animal. And so from the fact that we don't give that as a solution, but they do it outside the temple, outside the courtyard, this proves, like Reish Lakish said, partially going in is going to be considered going in. Says Rav Yosef, no, that's not a proof. That's not a proof. Why? Because Hamani, this price follows the position of Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar Meirachak Tzafon. Meaning to say, remember when we did this on Daf Chaf, that Rabbi was of the position that the animal could be slaughtered all the way to the eastern part of the courtyard. But Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda said it had to be slaughtered directly north, which was 22 amos away from the gate of the Nikanor. So his hand can't reach that far. So according to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, it would be impossible to stick your hand in. And so therefore, this price is not as proof because you couldn't have stuck your hand in. So it's not a support for Reish Lakish. Gemara says, but 1 second, we have a different solution. We have a pishpesh. Why don't we just make a hole, go directly north of the altar till the wall at the end of the courtyard on the northern part, which is what we would call today in the direction of Robinson's Arch, on the southern entrance to the Temple Mount. Just make a hole there in the wall of the courtyard and let the Mitzora stick his hands through that way, and then be able to do the smicha. So Abaye and Rabbi say, what? You're doing renovations on the temple? You come up with your renovation ideas? What do you think this is? Damri Chavayo, Akol B'Ksav. No, I have everything from God. God gave us a plan. God gave us the blueprint. We can't come up with our own blueprint about how to serve. We can't just start making holes in the walls of the temple. An alternative version of this discussion is a different way to override this attempted proof from this price. Comes from Amar Rav Yosef, you can't just stick your hands in. If you want to do smicha, you have to be all in. Now you have to stick your entire head and your body onto the animal. And so therefore, just by sticking your hands through, that would not be a sufficient smicha. And therefore, that's not a good solution that he could have just stuck his hands in. So it's not possible. So the Gemara says, well, my kasavar. The Gemara says, this Tano says, let's just take a little tangent and discuss this idea that all the smichos have to be directly before the shechita. So, what is his position? My kasaver, the Tano says that every smicha needs to be right before the shechita, except for the Asha Mitzora. What's his position? Ikasaver smichas Asha Mitzora is deraisa. Does he say that the Mitzora, when he does his smicha on his Asham offering, that's a biblical obligation? V'takef was smicha shlita deraisa, and also the idea that he needs to do smicha right before the shlita, that's also biblical. If that's the case, So if they have two biblical laws, the idea that he needs to do the smicha and the idea that it needs to be directly before the shlita are both biblical. The Rahman Amr, let him go into the courtyard of the temple. The Torah says he could do it. The Torah says you have to do it, so go in. So the Gemara says, no. Amr Avada Bar Masna, no. Yeah, even though it's actually a rare case, and even though the Torah says you have to do it, the rabbi said you can't, which is Gezerah Shema Yarbe B'Psilos. We're worried that on the way there, you'll do exactly the Torah. If the Torah allows you to do it, but they only allowed you to do it to a specific number of steps. To do it, you could go in there. But on the way back, maybe you'll take an extra step. Maybe you'll go one step in the wrong direction. You'll go beyond where you're supposed to. Once you're in, you think you're in. And no, and that'll be a sin. And that'll be a penalty of kari. So the rabbis made a decree to not allow you to do something the Torah did, which is a controversial concept. Iko de Amri, alternatively, Amar Avada Bar Asa, Bar Masna, that Svichas, alternative answers, Smichas Asha Mitzora is the Araisa. Yeah, that is the biblical idea, but V'tekef L'Smicha Shlita Lav the Araisa. But the idea that he has to do the Smicha right before the Shlita, that's actually not a biblical idea. That was a rabbinic idea to prevent what I said at the beginning, perhaps, which is that you might end up not bringing the carbon and then you misuse this animal. So Meisvei, the Gemara challenges this answer that the smicha right before the shlita is not a biblical idea. So the Gemara challenges, it says v'samach v'shachar. It says in the Torah in the beginning of Parashas Vayikra, Sefer Vayikra, Parashas Vayikra, it says v'samach yado al rosh ha'olah v'shachat es ben abakar, and he does smicha and then shlita, ma smicha b'tor and av shlita b'tor, and that just like smicha has to be done by somebody who's tahor, so to the shlita. V'yamr slav d'oraisa. If you say the smicha, if you're saying the smicha is not biblical, v'yamr slav d'oraisa, then if you say the smicha is not biblical, nami mishkachasla, then we're going to say we can also find this idea by we should be able to do it by somebody who's tamei. Meaning to say, because smicha is not connected, so the idea that the smicha is only by Torah, because it says Lifnei Hashem, and if it's possible, and so therefore you can't have the smicha outside the courtyard, and so therefore the tmeim cannot do it. So therefore you have to be Torah. Let's look at the Rashi. Meisei v'samach v'shachat v'hai desamchinu k'ra akisha samchinu. The reason why the Torah put the two psukim together is to make this comparison. Like we said, just like the smichas by Tahorim, smicha the pshitun on ba, and smicha that it's obvious for us that it needs Tahorim is because it says Lifnei Hashem, and b'shlita it says you need to be before God by the shlita. The tzricha shetei lifnim, that it needs to be inside the courtyard. Mishum the takaf lo smicha shlita. And so the fact that we know that smicha needs to be by Tahorim, it's because he also needs to be in there. And for the tamei to stand outside and do the smicha inside is impossible, because you need the whole rosho verubo, and so therefore that proves that you know that you need the smicha inside the temple. So it's clear from this inside the courtyard. So it's clear from this teaching that the smicha needs to be inside. So Ella Epoch, Smichos Asham Mitzora is Lav D'Oraisa. So Gemara says, okay, it's the reverse. The idea that the carbon Asham of Mitzora needs smicha, that's not biblical. The tekef with smicha shlita is D'Oraisa. Okay, so now we're on the top of 33a. Ravina says Le'inyan Malkus Itmar. Ravina says that which we said earlier in the name of Reish Lakish, that Bia B'Miktas. So remember, let's remind ourselves. Reish Lakish says that if you go partially and you get lashes, and the Gemara had, after the Gemara had said that, and Ula had said that Reish Lakish says that if you stick your hand partially in, you get lashes, and it's based upon the pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga, that you can't touch anything that's sacred. And just like you can't touch anything that's sacred, also you can't even put your hand into the courtyard of the temple. In that context, Rav Hoshaya raised the question from the case of the Tvul Yom, where we allowed the Tvul Yom to on the Erev Pesach to go in, and if you're saying partially in is prohibited, then how is the Tvul Yom allowed to put his hands into the Azara? And Reish Lakish's and Ula's answer to that was, once it's permitted for the Mitzvah, it's permitted also for the Tvul Yom. The Ishtri Laha. Once it's permitted for one thing, it's permitted for the other. But Ravina gives a different answer. Ravina says that the Inyan, and we're going to actually see now two more answers from the Gemara. Ravina's answer is Inyan Malkus Amra, meaning to say that Reish Lakish's law was only said with respect to lashes, but not with respect to kares. Meaning to say that the reason why the Tvul Yom was allowed to go in is because that was a kares penalty. And we say if you put your hand partially in, you get lashes, but we don't say you get kares under those circumstances. And so therefore, don't challenge him from the case of the Tvul Yom putting his hands in. Ki asa Ravin Amar, another answer. Ki asa Ravin Amar Rabbi Avo le'inyan tamei shenaga b'kodesh itmar. He says that law, with that pasuk that Reish Lakish said, B'chol kodesh lo tiga, which Ula had said, he said with respect to, you can't put your, hold on one second. Hold on one second. Okay, so let me start over here. So Rabin, he said in the name of Rabbi Avo, he says, he says this pasuk that Ula cited in the name of Reish Lakish, Kodesh Lo Tiga, which is with respect to that you can't even put your hands into the courtyard of the temple. That Rabin says no, that wasn't what the pasuk was cited by Reish Lakish for. He used it to teach us a different teaching. That what? It's only to teach us that a person who's tummy is not allowed to touch him, and if he touches something sacred, he gets lashes. The Idmar tummy, which is what the pasuk actually says, by the way. The Idmar tummy shenagla kodesh Reish Lakish amar loke. Now you get lashes if you're tummy you touch him. But Rabbi Yochanan says ain't no loke. Rabbi Yochanan says you don't get lashes. Reish Lakish amar loke b'chol kodesh lo tiga. Reish Lakish says you get lashes because b'chol kodesh lo tiga. And Rabbi Yochanan says you're anal loke. Rabbi Yochanan says you don't get lashes because that pasuk is not to teach us you can't touch him. You're not allowed to touch him, but you don't get lashes because that pasuk is to teach us truma. That pasuk is to teach us that a tame cannot touch truma. Reish Lakish I call says Reish Lakish. So the Gemara says, well, wait 1 second. Is Reish Lakish telling us that this pasuk is to teach us you can't touch him? I mean, by the way, Azar l'ochel basar kodesh. Isn't that pasuk teaching us that you can't eat kachim? Because we need that case to teach us. Demar Azar l'ochel basar kodesh minayin. How do we know you can't eat kachim if you're tamei? Reish Lakish amar b'chol kodesh lo tigaya. Reish Lakish uses a pasuk for that. And Rabbi Yochanan says Tani bardula asya. Rabbi Yochanan says that bardula taught tumasu mibias mikdash. Malalon. Anyway, but we see from here the point is that Reish Lakish uses that pasuk to teach us that you can't eat kachim, not that you can't touch kachim. So the Gemara says, yeah, it's possible to learn both these things. One, that you can't touch kachim. That's from the fact that Torah says tiga, the lashon of negi, of touching. Azar la'ochel, the fact that you can't eat it, iskish kodesh l'mikdash. From the fact that the word kodesh is compared to mikdash, and just from Just like it says, "B'chol kodesh lo tigav al mikdash lo tavo." And we learn from here that it says basar kodesh and not about touching it. So Tanya Kavasi the Rish Lakish. We have a brayso like Rish Lakish. Says B'chol kodesh lo tiga, and Azhara ochel. It's a warning that you can't eat it. Atomer Azhara ochel oinu ela lenoger. Maybe it means you can't touch it. Tamlomer B'chol kodesh lo tiga val mikdash lo tavo. It says you can't touch and you can't come in. Makish kodesh mikdash and makish mikdash davar sheyesh bo ma mikdash davar sheyesh bo netilas neshama. Av kodesh davar sheyesh bo netilas neshama. Even ogay netilas neshama miika ela b'achila. So it's referring to both touching and eating. Gemara says vakat, but wait, one more thing. We have one other thing. Vakat, we need that pasuk to teach us. That if you're tummy and you eat the kachim before it was sprinkled, Rish Lakish says loka. Yochanan Amar Eno loka. Rish Lakish says you get loka based on the pasuk. Rish Lakish Amar loka. Chol kodesh lo tiga. Lo ishna v'nei zrika, lo ishna achar zrika. Rabbi Yochanan says Eno loka. Rabbi Yochanan says you don't get lashes. Ketani bardula. Also timasu timasu. Now it's written after zrika. So is that pasuk written after zrika? So we see that Rish Lakish needs this pasuk to teach us this idea of getting if you sprinkle the blood after zrika. So the Gemara says imkain leimakra bekodesh. Pasuk could have just said bekodesh. My bechol kodesh, maminatartu. We learn both things. We see tamil you eat kodesh after zrika, and also if you eat it before zrika. Anyway, so now we're going to go back, continue this in Shabbos. Shikoyach to everybody.